Her mother had died in February, and by April she had sold everything that would sell. The house went first, then the furniture, then the 2 horses her father had left behind when he went west and didn't come back. She kept a trunk, a wool blanket, a cast iron pan, and the letter from a man named Donahue in the Saskatchewan territories who said he had land and needed a woman who knew how to work. She didn't know Donahue. Her aunt had arranged it through a man who arranged such things. She had 3 days to decide. She spent 2 of them sitting at the kitchen table of the house that no longer belonged to her, looking at the letter, reading it again, counting what she had and what she didn't. On the 3rd day, she wrote back and said she was coming. The train took 6 days from Winnipeg. She counted the fence posts when there were fence posts to count, and when there weren't, she watched the sky. The prairie came at her flat and enormous and indifferent, and she found she didn't mind it. She had lived her whole life surrounded by people who wanted things from her, and the land, at least, asked nothing. She arrived at the station in a town so small it wasn't marked on the map her aunt had given her. There was a grain elevator, a general store, a livery, and 4 houses. A man was waiting beside a wagon. He was younger than she expected. He had his hat in his hands and he kept turning it. He said her name like a question. She said yes. He put the hat back on and nodded and picked up her trunk without asking and set it in the wagon bed. She climbed up herself. He went around to the other side and they drove north without speaking for most of an hour. She watched the land. It was late April, and the snow was still in the low places. The grass was the color of old rope. The sky was the kind of blue that hurts if you look at it too long. He spoke once to say the road was better in summer. She said that was good to know. He didn't speak again. The property appeared over a low rise. She looked at it carefully. She was the kind of person who looked at things carefully. There was a house, 1-story, squared logs, the chinking cracked and missing in places. A barn that listed to the east, 3 outbuildings in varying stages of collapse, a fence that had given up on 2 sides, and beyond all of it, stretching north and west, the land itself, flat and dark and enormous. She noted all of it without expression. He stopped the wagon and sat a moment before he got down. He said the house was small. She said she could see that. He said he hadn't gotten around to the fence yet. She said she could see that too. He looked at her then, just briefly, and she couldn't tell if he was relieved or embarrassed. He showed her the house. It had 2 rooms, a stove, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf with 4 tins on it, and a curtain hung across the back corner where a cot was. He said she'd have the cot and he'd sleep in the barn until they figured things out. She said that was fine. He showed her the barn. 3 cattle, thin but standing. A draft horse with a good eye. He showed her the outbuildings, one by one. In the last one, against the back wall, there were 23 chickens and a rooster in a pen made of scrap lumber and old wire. He said the chickens were the main thing. He said if she could keep the chickens laying, they could sell the eggs in town every 2 weeks, and that would cover flour and salt and what they needed until the cattle sold in fall. He said it wasn't much to ask. He said he'd handle the cattle and the field and the fence, and she'd handle the house and the chickens, and that seemed fair to him. She looked at the chickens. They were Rhode Island Reds mostly, with a few others mixed in. The pen was dirty and too small, and the rooster had a bad leg. The water trough was green. She counted the birds, and she looked at the light that came through the 1 small window. And she thought about the winter they'd come through, and what a chicken needs to lay, and what happens when it doesn't get those things. She told him the chickens needed more light. He said there was a window. She said it wasn't enough. He said they'd been laying fine before winter. She didn't say anything to that. She just looked at the rooster and then at him. And he looked back at her, and she could tell he didn't want to argue with a woman he'd known for 2 hours. He said she could do what she thought best with the chickens. She said she would. That first night she made bannock from his flour and fried salt pork from a tin she found on the shelf. He ate what she put in front of him and said thank you. She ate her own portion standing at the stove because she hadn't decided yet if she was going to sit at that table like she belonged there. She decided by morning. She sat at the table for breakfast. He was already out when she woke. She heard the barn door, then the cattle, then quiet. She made tea and ate the last of the bannock cold, and then she put on her coat and went outside. She walked the whole property. She did it slowly, and she did it once, and she didn't go back over it. She looked at where the sun came from in the morning and where it went in the afternoon. She looked at the soil at the fence line and the way the water would run when the snow came off. She looked at the outbuildings again and picked the one she wanted. That afternoon, she started cleaning the chicken house. He came in at noon and found her carrying the old dirty straw out in armloads. He stood in the doorway and watched her. He said he thought she was going to get them laying more. She said she was. He said carrying straw seemed like a lot of work for that. She said a laying hen needs a clean house, enough light, and enough to eat. She said right now they had none of those things. He looked at the chickens for a moment, and then he went back to the field. She worked until the light went. She cut a second window into the south wall of the chicken house using a handsaw she found in the barn. It took her most of a morning and her hands blistered on the handle, but she didn't stop. She covered it with oiled cloth because there was no glass, and she told herself she'd find glass before winter. She found glass. There was a broken window in the back outbuilding, the one that was falling apart, and 2 of the panes were still whole. She pulled them out carefully, one at a time, and carried them across the yard and set them in the frames she'd made from scrapboards. He watched her carry the second pane across the yard. He was mending harness on the steps of the barn. He didn't say anything while she was doing it. When she came back past him, he said that was good thinking about the glass. She said thank you. She moved the water trough inside where it wouldn't freeze at night, and she cleaned it twice a week. She built a new roost from poles she cut at the creek edge, spaced right so the birds weren't crowded. She found a low spot behind the barn where the previous owner had thrown kitchen scraps and where the grass grew thick and dark, and she dug up that soil and mixed it into the pen floor so the chickens could scratch. The rooster's leg healed on its own. She hadn't done anything particular for it except give it room. By June, the hens were laying 11 eggs a day, sometimes 12. He drove to town the first time with 24 eggs in a crate lined with straw. He came back and said old Mrs. Dunmore at the store had asked where he'd gotten such good eggs. He told her from his place. She'd asked if he had more. He'd said he'd bring them next time. He told her all of this standing at the door, still holding his hat. She was making supper. She said that was good to hear. He said it was more than he expected. She didn't say anything to that. She stirred the pot. She planted a kitchen garden in May. There was no fence around it, so she put one up herself, 4 posts and chicken wire, and she planted what she had seed for: carrots, turnips, onions, and a row of potatoes along the south edge. He came past one evening while she was on her knees setting seed, and he stopped and looked at the little fence and the turned soil, and he said he hadn't known she knew about gardens. She said there was a lot he didn't know about her yet. He seemed to think about that. Then he went on to the barn. She did know about gardens. She knew about a great many things that hadn't been asked of her. She knew how to lime a root cellar so it didn't mold. She did it in June, once the ground was dry. He didn't notice for 2 weeks, and then one day he went down for a tin and came back up and said the cellar smelled different. She said she'd limed it. He said, huh. He went back out. She knew how to read the sky. In July, she watched 3 days of high cloud building from the northwest, and she told him on the 3rd morning that the rain was coming and they should get the hay in before noon. He looked at the sky. It was still clear. He said he'd planned to cut more today. She said he should cut what he had and get it in. He stood there a moment, and then he went and got the horse. The rain came at 2 in the afternoon, hard and fast, and it ran in sheets off the barn roof for 4 hours. His hay was inside and dry. He didn't mention it. But after that, when she said something about the weather, he listened. The summer passed in work. She did not find it hard in the way she expected. She found it tiring, which was different. Tired, she could sleep off. Hard stayed in you. She learned the sound of the cattle when something was wrong. She learned which board in the barn floor had a nail coming up that would catch a hoof wrong. She learned he took his tea with 1 spoon of sugar, and he didn't want to talk in the morning, and that he would work past dark without stopping if she didn't put food on the table. So she started making a point of putting food on the table. He learned she didn't like the lantern left burning in an empty room. He started turning it off. She noticed. She didn't say she noticed. There was a woman in town, a Mrs. Threlkeld, who ran the post and kept track of everyone's business because it was a small place and someone had to. She saw them at the store in August, and she looked at the two of them standing at the counter, and she said, "Well, you look like you've settled in." She was looking at the woman when she said it, as if she was the one who might not have. The woman said yes, they had. Mrs. Threlkeld asked how the chickens were doing. The woman told her. Mrs. Threlkeld asked if she'd considered geese. She said she had not. Mrs. Threlkeld said geese were good for keeping foxes off. She said she'd think about it. She did think about it. She thought it was not a bad idea. But she had enough to manage, and she filed it away, for later the way she filed most things. In September, a man named Gowrie came by on his way through to Battleford. He was an older man, a neighbor from 2 townships over, and he had known the previous owner of the property. He stopped at the yard and looked around for a long time before he got off his horse. He walked the fence line and looked at the chicken house and looked at the garden, and then he came up and shook the man's hand and said he hadn't recognized the place. He said he'd ridden by the summer before last and thought it was going under. The man said it had been close. Gowrie looked at her then. He said she'd done good work. She said they both had. Gowrie smiled like he knew something. He said yes, yes, of course, but he kept looking at her. After he left, the man was quiet for a while. They were doing the evening feeding when he finally said something. He said Gowrie wasn't wrong. He said she'd done more than he'd asked. She put the feed pail down. She waited. He said he'd only asked about the chickens because he thought she'd manage them and not much else. He said he hadn't known. He stopped. He said he should have asked more or asked better or not, said chickens like it was all there was. She looked at him. He was a man who did not talk a great deal, and this was a great deal for him. She said she knew what he'd meant. She said she hadn't minded. He looked at the barn roof. He said he was going to get that east wall before winter. She said it needed it. He said he knew. There was a long quiet, the kind that doesn't need filling. She picked up the feed pail. The first frost came early, the 3rd week of September. She was up before him, and she went out in the dark and moved the last of the root vegetables before the ground took them. She got the carrots and the turnips and most of the onions. She lost a few potatoes along the east edge of the garden, where the frost had gone deeper than she expected. She noted this for next year. She would plant the east edge later. He found her stacking turnips in the root cellar when he came in from morning chores. She had mud on her coat and her hands were cold. He didn't say anything right away. He looked at the stack of vegetables and the 2 crates of onions and the bag of potatoes, and he said that was a good cellar. She said they'd eat well. He said yes. The cattle sold in October, 3 of them. He came back from town with the money and sat at the table and counted it out and said it was more than last year. He said it was enough to get through winter and have something for seed in spring. She was washing the supper dishes at the basin. She said that was good. He said it was better than good. He said last year he hadn't been sure about spring. She turned around and looked at him. He was still looking at the money on the table. She said she hadn't known it was that close. He said he hadn't wanted to say. She turned back to the dishes. She thought about the letter and the 3 days she'd had to decide and what she'd thought she was coming to. She thought about the word bankrupt that Donahue had not used, but that had been there anyway, in what he didn't say. She thought she would have come anyway. She wasn't sure why she would have, but she thought she would have. The snow came in November, and it came to stay. He mended the east wall of the barn before it arrived, working 3 days straight, and she chinked the house walls with a mixture she made from clay and straw and let dry. And by the time the temperature dropped, the house held heat, better than it had in September. She could tell because the frost didn't creep as far up the inside of the window glass. She had 31 chickens by December. 8 of them were young hens, pullets she'd raised from eggs she'd set in July under a broody hen she'd noticed going off by herself into the corner. She'd built a small box and set 12 eggs and waited, and 8 had hatched and 6 had been female. She'd sold the 2 roosters to a woman on the next property, a Mrs. Abernethy, who had wanted to start her own flock. Mrs. Abernethy had come to collect them herself, driving a cart alone 6 miles in October cold, and she'd looked at the chicken house and the garden and the yard and said something to herself under her breath. She'd said it quietly, but the woman had heard it. She'd said, "He did well for himself." She thought about that. She wasn't sure what to make of it. She decided to take it as a compliment to the property and let the rest of it go. They ate well that winter, not extravagantly. There were dried onions and carrots and turnips and potatoes, salt pork and dried beans, flour for bread, oats, tea, and eggs every morning, because she had 31 hens and they were healthy and laying steady. He said once, eating breakfast in January with the wind going hard against the north wall, that he hadn't eaten this well since he was a boy. She said she was glad to hear it. He said he meant it. She said she knew. There were nights when the temperature dropped so low that the windows went completely white. And the sound of the cold was a creak and pop in the logs, and she lay on her cot and listened to it and thought about the city, the house that had been sold, the people who would have found it strange that she was here. Her mother would have found it strange. Her mother had always believed that comfort was the point of effort. She had never understood that sometimes the effort was the point. She thought she was the right person for this land. She wasn't sure it worked the other way. She wasn't sure the land cared about her at all. But she could work with indifference. She had more trouble with expectations. In February the 23rd, she got 33 chickens and 1 dead hen. She found it in the morning still and stiff in the corner. No mark on it. She noted it was 32 hens now. She carried the dead one out and set it outside the fence. She went back in and counted the eggs in the morning collection and didn't think about it further. That was also something she knew how to do. Spring came the way it always does in that country, all at once, then pulled back, then all at once again. The snow went in a week and left the yard a sea of mud, so deep it pulled at her boots with every step, and twice she left a boot in it and had to fish it out with her hand. He built a small board walkway from the house to the barn. He did it without mentioning it first. She noticed the next morning when she went to feed the chickens and her boots stayed on her feet. She looked at the walkway for a moment. Then she went to the chicken house. They drove to town together in April, the first time she'd gone since February. Mrs. Threlkeld was at the store counter, and she looked at the two of them come in together, and she said something about the winter and asked how they'd gotten on and whether they'd had any trouble. The man said no trouble. Mrs. Threlkeld looked at the woman and said she'd heard the egg business was doing well. The woman said they'd had good layers this year. Mrs. Threlkeld said she'd heard more than that. She said Gowrie had told his wife, who had told Mrs. Threlkeld that the Donahue place, she caught herself, that their place was looking like a real going concern now. She said people had been surprised. Some of them pleasantly, she said, and she smiled in the way of someone who means to include herself in the pleasant group. The woman bought 2 spools of thread and a pound of baking powder and a small tin of boot black. He bought seed and a new hinge and a box of rifle cartridges. They drove home together without talking much. The land was showing green, just at the edges of things, a strip of green along the creek, green in the low swales, green creeping up the fence posts. She watched it come. She had watched it in other places, her mother's garden, the park near the school where she had taught, briefly, one winter, but it had always felt like something happening elsewhere that she was observing. Here, it felt different. Here it felt like something returning to a place it had always been. She planted the garden the 3rd week of May, a week later than the year before, and she moved the east edge in by 4 feet. He noticed when he walked past and asked if she was making it smaller. She said she was moving the east edge. He said, why? She said because the frost had taken it early last year. He said, kept walking. She put in a row of cabbages along the south fence where the heat collected. She put in the carrots and turnips and onions in the same places as before, but more of them. She put in a small section of peas along the chicken house wall where they could climb the wire. And she put in 2 rows of something she hadn't tried before, a vegetable she'd read about in a seed catalog Mrs. Threlkeld kept at the store. A variety of squash that stored long and hard and kept all winter without the root sellers. She wasn't sure it would take in this soil. She planted it anyway. The squash took. By July, she had the best garden she'd ever grown. She couldn't have said why exactly. The soil, the light, the dry heat that came off the flat land in the afternoons. She thought maybe she had just finally grown something in the right place. She began selling vegetables at the store. Not much at first. A few pounds of carrots, a bag of turnips. Mrs. Threlkeld put them on the counter with a small card that said garden produce and wrote where they came from on the card. People bought them. The next week she brought more. By August, she was bringing eggs and vegetables to town every week, not every two. He rearranged the driving to make it work. He didn't say anything about it. He just did it. In September, a man from a property 12 miles north, a man named Burgess, stopped at the yard and asked if she sold squash. He had a wife who'd been looking for squash for a particular recipe she'd always made. She sold him 4 squash for reasonable money, and he said he'd be back next year, and she said she'd plant extra. He had watched this exchange from the barn. Later, eating supper, he said Burgess had never stopped at this place before. She said she knew. He said, not in 3 years. She said she knew that too. He looked at his plate and then he looked at her and he said she had built something here. She looked out the window. The yard was quiet. Chickens were settled in for the night. The garden was past its height now, but the squash still sat along the east fence, fat and orange and solid. She said they had built something. He said yes. That was what he'd meant. She looked at him to see if it was. He was already looking back at his plate. She decided to take it that way. She was getting better at that, at deciding what a thing meant and letting it stay that way. Winter came again, and they were ready for it. The cellar was full. The hens were healthy. The barn was sound. He had put a second layer of board on the north wall of the barn in October, and she had woven extra straw into the ceiling of the chicken house for warmth. They had done it without discussing who would do what. She noticed this. She thought it might be the best thing about the year, that there were things that needed doing, and they both knew which ones were theirs. On the first Sunday of December, he came in from morning chores and sat at the table, and she put tea in front of him and sat down across from him with her own. The wind was doing what it did. The stove made its noise. Outside, the yard was white and still. He said he thought they were going to be all right. She said she thought so too. He put both hands around the mug. He looked at the table. He said he wanted her to know that he understood she had done more than he'd asked. He said he'd asked her to come here and manage the chickens, and what she had done was manage everything. He said he thought that wasn't fair, that he'd come to it with small ideas, and she had come to it with. He stopped. He said he hadn't had the words for it at the time. She waited. He said she had come to it with a whole mind. She looked at her tea. She thought about all the things she'd looked at when she arrived. The tilted barn, the broken fence, the green water trough, the rooster with the bad leg. She thought about the second window she'd cut into the chicken house wall, and the glass panes she'd carried across the yard, and the morning she'd woken up before dawn to save the carrots from the frost. She said she had come to it with what she had. He nodded. He picked up his mug. Outside, the wind moved through the yard. The chickens were quiet. The snow sat on the fields the way snow sits when it means to stay. And the sky above it was the hard, clear blue of deep winter, and the land stretched north and west without apology, and somewhere along the creek the ice was thickening, and the willows were bowed and still. She drank her tea. She was home.